The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of energy and life. But what happens when something from beyond the stars arrives, something that exists outside the Force entirely, a presence so alien that reality itself bends and breaks to accommodate it? In the darkness between dimensions, in the spaces where hyperspace routes dare not venture, ancient things wait. And sometimes, in their arrogance, mortals forget that the galaxy is not theirs alone. The Imperial exploration vessel Terminus had been pushing deeper into the unknown regions for 3 standard months. Captain Jessa Voren stood on the bridge, watching the swirling chaos of uncharted hyperspace through the viewport. Her orders from High Command were clear: map new routes, catalog resources, expand the Empire's reach into territories the Republic had never dared to explore. It was tedious work, but it was safe work, or so she believed. "Captain, we're detecting an anomaly," her navigation officer announced, his voice uncertain. "It's not on any charts. I don't know what it is." Voren approached the sensor station, studying the readouts. A gravitational distortion, massive and impossible, pulsed in the void ahead. It wasn't a black hole, the signature was all wrong. It wasn't a star or planet. It was something else, something that made the instruments flicker and occasionally display readings that violated known physics. "Pull us out of hyperspace," she ordered. "All stop." The Terminus shuddered as it dropped back into real space, and what greeted them defied comprehension. Ahead, space itself seemed to fold inward, creating a wound in reality. Colors that had no names bled from the edges. The stars around it bent and twisted, their light spiraling into the darkness at the center. "Captain, we should retreat," her executive officer said quietly, his face pale. "Whatever that is, it's not natural." Voren agreed, but curiosity, that fatal human flaw, made her hesitate. The Empire rewarded those who brought back valuable discoveries. A genuine spatial anomaly could advance her career significantly. "Launch a probe. Let's get some readings before we leave." The probe streaked toward the rift, its instruments broadcasting data. For 30 seconds, everything seemed normal. Then the probe's signal warped, the telemetry becoming nonsensical. Temperature readings showed both absolute zero and temperatures exceeding stellar cores. Distance measurements contradicted themselves. And then, for just a moment, the probe's optical feed showed something in the darkness, something vast, something with angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. The crew member monitoring the feed screamed and collapsed, blood streaming from his nose. "Medical team to the bridge." Voren shouted, rushing to the fallen officer. His eyes had rolled back, and he was whispering something in a language she didn't recognize. The words felt wrong in her ears, like her brain was rejecting them. The rift pulsed. Every light on the bridge flickered. The viewports showed the anomaly expanding, reaching toward them with tendrils of impossible geometry. Voren felt something brush against her mind, cold, ancient, utterly indifferent to her existence. It was like being noticed by a void that was somehow alive and aware. Full reverse. "Get us away from that thing," she screamed. The Terminus engines roared to life, pushing the vessel backward, but the rift was expanding faster. Reality peeled away in sheets around them. 2 crew members began laughing hysterically. Another was weeping, clawing at his own face. Through the chaos, Voren heard it, not with her ears, but directly in her mind. A whisper. A word that was more feeling than sound, more concept than language. "Leia." The ship shook violently. Bulkheads groaned. Then, as suddenly as it had expanded, the rift collapsed inward, taking 3 of the Terminus's aft compartments with it. The vessel spun through space, emergency alarms blaring, but they were free. Voren pulled herself up from where she'd fallen, her hands shaking. Half her crew was dead or incapacitated. The others stared at the viewports with hollow eyes, seeing something that wasn't there. And in the back of her mind, she felt it, something had noticed them. Something had awakened. She reached for the communications console with trembling fingers. This was beyond her authority, beyond anything Imperial protocol had prepared her for. This needed to reach the highest levels of command. This needed to reach Darth Vader. Across the galaxy, in the Force-sensitive corners of civilization, something changed. On Tatooine, an old Jedi Master jerked awake in his desert hovel, his heart racing. On Coruscant, the Emperor paused mid-sentence during a strategy meeting, his yellow eyes narrowing. The dreams of a sunken city beneath alien waves, where towers reached toward skies that were never meant to exist, where something dead lay dreaming, waiting for the stars to align. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The message from the Terminus reached Imperial Center within 48 hours. It was flagged as Priority Alpha, potential strategic threat. Within the hour, it sat on the desk of Grand Moff Tarkin. Within 2 hours, Darth Vader was reviewing the sensor logs, his breathing the only sound in the silent chamber. He watched the probe footage 3 times. Each time, he felt it, that wrongness, that sensation of the Force twisting away from something it couldn't comprehend. The Emperor had taught him to sense disturbances in the Force, to feel the ripples of significant events across the galaxy. But this was different. This wasn't a disturbance in the Force. This was something the Force feared. The dreams began 3 days after the Terminus incident. They were not isolated to a single world or species. They crossed the arbitrary boundaries of Imperial space, Hutt territories, and the scattered remnants of the Old Republic. Jedi in hiding woke screaming. Dark side cultists found themselves worshipping at altars they didn't remember building. Force-sensitive children drew pictures of cities that existed in geometries their parents couldn't understand. On Naboo, a former handmaiden of the late Senator Amidala dreamed of drowning in an ocean that existed in the wrong number of dimensions. On Nar Shaddaa, a Twi'lek information broker saw visions of towers rising from abyssal depths, their surfaces covered in glyphs that hurt to perceive. On Kashyyyk, Wookiee shamans experienced collective nightmares of something vast stirring beneath the universe itself. The dreams all shared common elements. Water that wasn't water, a city that couldn't exist, and the overwhelming sensation of being observed by something that regarded all life with the same indifference a human might show bacteria. Most disturbing was the consistency. Beings who had never met, who lived systems apart, were dreaming the exact same architectural impossibilities. Imperial intelligence catalogued the reports as psychological anomalies, possibly the result of a rebel biological weapon. But on Coruscant, in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, Emperor Palpatine stood before an ancient Sith holocron, his face illuminated by its crimson glow. The holographic gatekeeper, a long-dead Sith Lord from an era predating Darth Bane, spoke in a language that hadn't been used in 4,000 years. The sleeper stirs, the ancient Sith whispered. The old warnings were true. There are things that exist beyond the Force, beyond light and dark. The ancient Sith knew this. They built their empire on the principle that the dark side was the ultimate power in the universe. The gatekeeper's form flickered. They were wrong. Palpatine's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly. Explain. In the time before recorded history, when the Rakata ruled the galaxy through the Force, they encountered others. Entities from dimensions adjacent to our own. The Force could not touch them. They could not be turned, could not be dominated, could not be understood. The Rakata tried to enslave them as they had enslaved so many species. The gatekeeper's voice lowered. Entire star systems went silent. The Rakata fled those regions, sealing them away with prohibitions that lasted millennia. They called them the abyssal reaches. Your empire calls them the unknown regions. And these entities? Palpatine asked, his voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. They wait. They sleep. And when foolish mortals disturb them, they do not conquer. They do not destroy. The gatekeeper paused. They simply exist, and reality changes to accommodate them. The Force itself withdraws from their presence, like water recoiling from poison. Palpatine deactivated the holocron and stood in darkness, contemplating. He had spent decades consolidating his power, eliminating the Jedi, turning the Republic into his empire. He had mastered the dark side, bent the Force to his will, and positioned himself as the ultimate authority in the galaxy. The idea that something existed beyond his reach, beyond the Force itself, was intriguing and deeply threatening. If such an entity could be controlled, weaponized, it would secure his rule forever. If it could not be controlled, it represented the only genuine threat to his carefully constructed order. He reached out through the Force, summoning his most powerful servant. Aboard the Executor, Darth Vader felt the Emperor's call like a knife through his meditation. He rose from his chamber, cape sweeping behind him, and moved toward the communications suite. Within moments, he was kneeling before the holographic projection of his master, the flickering blue image towering over him. "What is thy bidding, my master?" "The anomaly in the unknown regions," Palpatine said without preamble. "It is not merely a spatial distortion. It is a doorway. Something is coming through, something that exists outside the natural order. I sense your unease, Lord Vader. The Force recoils from this presence." "I have felt it," Vader admitted, his mechanical voice echoing in the chamber. "My meditations are disrupted. The Force shows me fragmented visions. A city beneath water. Something vast and patient. The ancient Sith knew of such things," Palpatine continued. "They called them the Star Spawn, beings from dimensions where the laws of reality differ from our own. One is awakening. Its psychic influence is spreading across the galaxy, manifesting in the dreams of Force sensitives. This cannot be ignored." Vader remained kneeling, but his mind raced. He had faced many threats since his transformation: Jedi survivors, rebel cells, political rivals. All could be dealt with through the dark side, through fear and power. But something that existed outside the Force. Something the Force itself avoided. "I will investigate personally," Vader said. "If this entity threatens the Empire, it will be destroyed." "You misunderstand the nature of the threat, my apprentice." Palpatine's hologram leaned forward slightly. "This is not something that can be destroyed by lightsabers or Force lightning. The ancient Sith learned this at great cost. But it may be something that can be contained, studied, perhaps even turned to our purposes. The rebels grow bolder each day. Imagine unleashing something upon them that their precious hope and righteousness cannot touch. Something that simply unmakes them." Vader stood, his towering frame casting long shadows. "Where do I begin?" The Inquisitorius has been tracking increased cult activity in the Outer Rim. Beings gathering in hidden temples, worshipping something they call the Sleeper. They speak of a city called Leia, of a herald who will prepare the way. Take your Inquisitors. Find these cultists. Learn what they know. And Vader, be cautious. The dark side is powerful, but it is still bound by the Force. What awakens is not. The hologram flickered out, leaving Vader alone in the darkness. He could feel it even now, that cold, patient presence at the edge of his awareness. It was like standing at the precipice of an abyss that stared back with something approximating consciousness. Every instinct the Force gave him screamed to turn away, to flee. But Darth Vader had never fled from anything. He activated his personal comm, summoned the fifth brother and the seventh sister. "Prepare my shuttle. We depart for the Outer Rim within the hour." As he strode toward the hangar bay, he passed a viewport showing the stars. For just a moment, he could have sworn the darkness between them shifted, that the empty spaces held something watching. He reached out through the Force, trying to sense what was there. The Force gave him nothing. Just a void, cold and patient and utterly indifferent. On a forgotten ocean world in the unknown regions, in depths no light had ever reached, something vast began to move. Not quickly, it had waited for eons, and time meant nothing to it. But the dimensions were aligning, the barriers thinning. The dreams it sent were not communications. They were simply its presence bleeding through the cracks in reality, its existence so fundamentally alien that mortal minds interpreted it as nightmare. It did not hate the galaxy or love it. It did not seek to rule or destroy. It simply was, and its awakening would rewrite the laws of existence for thousands of light years in every direction. The Force, that mystical energy field that bound the galaxy together, felt it stirring and did the only thing it could do. It withdrew, leaving dead zones in its wake, spaces where Force sensitives would find themselves suddenly, terrifyingly mortal. The fifth brother hated cult investigations. They were tedious, predictable, and rarely provided the satisfaction of hunting actual Jedi. Dark side worshippers were common in the Outer Rim, desperate beings grasping at power they didn't understand, performing rituals copied from half-remembered legends. The Inquisitors typically left such groups alone unless they became politically problematic. Fear of the dark side served the Empire's purposes. But this assignment came directly from Vader, which meant it mattered. The shuttle descended through the murky atmosphere of Geonosis, the ancient droid foundries visible as skeletal ruins across the desert surface. The Empire had sterilized the planet years ago, exterminating the native population to secure its secrets. Now it was supposedly empty, a perfect hiding place for those who wished to remain unseen. Seventh Sister, report, the fifth brother said into his comm as their shuttle touched down near a canyon system the orbital scans had flagged. I sensed them, came her voice, smooth and calculating. Dozens of life signs in the caves below. But something's wrong. The Force feels thin here. Like trying to breathe in a depressurized chamber. The fifth brother felt it too. As he descended the shuttle ramp, lightsaber ready, he reached out through the Force as he'd been trained. The dark side should have been strong here, fear, suffering, and death had saturated this world. Instead, he felt almost nothing, just a hollow echo where power should have been. Vader emerged from the shuttle, his breathing apparatus the only sound in the dead silence of Geonosis. He didn't ignite his lightsaber, merely surveyed the canyon entrance with his masked gaze. They are below. Stay alert. This is not a typical cult. They descended into the caves, using glow rods to illuminate the passages. The walls were covered in frescoes, crude paintings that hurt to look at directly. The images showed towers rising from water, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, and a central figure that the fifth brother's mind refused to properly process. His eyes told him it was humanoid, but also octopoid, but also draconic, but also none of these things. My lord, the seventh sister said, her usual confidence wavering. These symbols. I've seen them before. In the Jedi archives, in a restricted section. They were classified as pre-Republic artifacts, forbidden to study. Vader stopped before one particular fresco. It depicted a starfield, but the stars were wrong, arranged in configurations that violated celestial mechanics. And at the center, a rift, identical to the one the Terminus had discovered. The Jedi knew, Vader said quietly, more to himself than his Inquisitors. They encountered this before. And they hid the knowledge rather than confronting it. They continued deeper until the passage opened into a vast chamber. And there, the fifth brother understood why this was not a typical cult. Hundreds of beings filled the cavern, humans, Twi'leks, Rodians, even a few Wookiees. They sat in concentric circles around a pool of water that shouldn't exist on this desert world. The water was wrong, too dark, moving in patterns that defied fluid dynamics. Hanging above the pool was something that made the fifth brother's stomach turn, a massive sculpture constructed from metal, bone, and materials he couldn't identify. It depicted the same figure from the frescoes, and looking at it directly caused physical pain behind his eyes. But what truly disturbed him was the cultists themselves. They weren't chanting or performing rituals. They simply sat, staring at the water with expressions of perfect serenity. Their eyes were open but unseeing. And from each of them, the fifth brother felt nothing. No fear, no passion, no connection to the Force whatsoever. It was as if they'd been severed from it entirely. In the name of the Galactic Empire, you are all under arrest, Vader's voice boomed through the chamber. Not one cultist reacted. They continued staring at the pool, their breathing synchronized, their faces blank. The seventh sister moved forward, lightsaber ignited, its red blade casting crimson light across the chamber. She approached the nearest cultist, a human male with the remnants of an Imperial uniform. Identify yourself. The man didn't blink. Didn't acknowledge her presence at all. She touched him with the Force, attempting to compel a response. Nothing. It was like trying to grasp smoke. The man's mind was there, she could sense the biological function of his brain. But his consciousness was somewhere else, submerged in something vast and cold. They're not here, she said, her voice tight. Their bodies function, but their minds are elsewhere. Where? The fifth brother demanded, fighting down panic. He'd seen many horrors in his service to the Empire, death, torture, the broken remains of Jedi, but this was different. This was wrongness on a fundamental level. One of the cultists spoke. Not the one the seventh sister had touched, but a Twi'lek woman on the far side of the circle. Her voice was flat, emotionless, speaking basic with an accent that didn't match any known Twi'lek dialect. The sleeper dreams, and we dream with it. Leia rises in angles reality cannot sustain. The stars align. The gateway opens. The herald comes. Then another cultist spoke, in perfect synchronization, the sleeper dreams, and we dream with it. Leia rises in angles reality cannot sustain. The stars align. The gateway opens. The herald comes. Then another. And another. Within seconds, all 400 cultists were speaking in perfect unison, the same words, the same inflection, as though a single consciousness was using hundreds of mouths. Vader stepped forward, raising his hand. The Force surged, not to attack, but to sever whatever connection bound these beings. Dark side energy crackled through the chamber. The fifth brother felt the raw power of it, the overwhelming strength of Vader's will. It did nothing. The cultists continued their synchronized chant, utterly unaffected. Vader's breathing grew harsh, labored. The fifth brother realized with shock that his master was straining, pushing the limits of his power against something that simply ignored it. Impossible, Vader hissed. Nothing resists the Force. The water in the pool began to ripple. The fifth brother's instincts screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, watching as the surface tension broke and something began to emerge. Not a physical form, not exactly. More like reality itself was bending, creating a space where something that shouldn't exist could manifest. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in seconds. Frost formed on the cave walls. And in the minds of all three Force sensitives, they felt it, a presence so vast and alien that the Force recoiled from it like living tissue from flame. The cultist spoke again, but this time the words were different, a language that predated basic, that predated any language the galaxy had ever known, Pchenglui mglw naf Cthulhu relio gonagelftain. The fifth brother didn't understand the words, but their meaning seared into his consciousness anyway. In his house at Leia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The thing in the water was not Cthulhu, that entity was still far away, still sleeping. This was merely an echo, a fragment of its consciousness testing the boundaries of this dimension. But even a fragment was too much. The seventh sister screamed and fell to her knees, her lightsaber deactivating. Blood streamed from her nose. The fifth brother felt his own mind beginning to fracture, unable to process what he was perceiving. The thing in the water existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. Looking at it meant seeing all its possible angles of existence at once, and mortal brains weren't designed to handle such information. Vader alone remained standing, one hand extended, not in attack but in futile defense. His breathing was ragged, stressed beyond anything the fifth brother had heard before. The Dark Lord of the Sith, the Emperor's enforcer, the being who had brought the Jedi Order to its knees, was helpless before this thing. "Retreat," Vader commanded, his voice barely controlled. "Now." The fifth brother grabbed the seventh sister and ran. Vader followed, moving with desperate speed, not the measured, terrifying pace he usually employed. Behind them, the cultists continued their chant, and the presence in the water grew stronger, more defined. They burst from the caves into the harsh sunlight of Geonosis, and even here, the temperature was wrong. The sky had taken on a sickly hue, colors bleeding at the edges of perception. The fifth brother could still feel it, that vast, patient consciousness, now aware of them. Not hostile, not even particularly interested. Just aware, the way a human might be vaguely aware of insects crawling on their skin. On the shuttle, Vader stood at the viewport, silent. His breathing was slowly returning to normal, but the fifth brother could sense something he'd never felt from his master before, uncertainty. "My lord," the fifth brother said carefully, "what was that?" Vader didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that transcended his usual menace. "Something the Sith should have left sleeping. Contact the Emperor. Tell him the cults are not worshipping the dark side. They are worshipping something far older." The cult activity spread like a plague across the Outer Rim. Within 2 weeks of Vader's encounter on Geonosis, Imperial intelligence reported 47 separate gatherings, each following the same pattern: beings of all species abandoning their lives to congregate near bodies of water, constructing monuments to something they called the Sleeper, speaking in synchronized voices about Leia and the coming herald. On Ryloth, an entire village of Twi'leks walked into the Bright Lands desert and was never seen again. On Ord Mantell, a criminal syndicate's warehouse was discovered filled with cultists who had carved non-Euclidean patterns into their own flesh. On Dantooine, settlers reported that the grasslands had developed patches where reality seemed thin, where animals refused to go and Force-sensitive individuals experienced complete disconnection. The Empire's response was predictable: overwhelming force. Stormtrooper battalions were dispatched to arrest or eliminate the cultists. But the troopers returned with reports that defied military logic. Cultists didn't resist arrest, they simply weren't present, even when their bodies remained. Interrogation was impossible because there was no individual consciousness to interrogate, just hundreds of voices speaking the same incomprehensible phrases. Worse, the troopers themselves were affected. Psychological evaluations showed increased rates of night terrors, dissociation, and in extreme cases, desertion to join the very cults they'd been sent to suppress. On Nar Shaddaa, in a cantina that catered to the galaxy's most dangerous information brokers, a Devaronian named Vexenar was making a fortune. He specialized in selling knowledge that others wouldn't touch: Sith artifacts, Jedi holocrons, restricted Imperial intelligence. But his latest acquisition was unlike anything he'd handled before. The hooded figure across from him placed a data chip on the table between them. 50,000 credits, the figure said, voice distorted by a vocoder. For everything we know about the sleeper cults. Vexenar examined the chip with professional skepticism. The Empire's been cracking down on those fanatics. Why would I pay for information they're giving away through their propaganda broadcasts? Because the Empire is lying. The figure leaned forward. They're not eliminating the cults. They're studying them. And what they're learning terrifies them. That got Vexenar's attention. Fear was currency in the underworld, and if something scared the Empire badly enough to lie about it, that information was worth far more than 50,000 credits. He inserted the chip into his datapad and began scrolling through the files. What he saw made his blood run cold. Internal Imperial communications, classified reports from Admiral Pyatt, medical evaluations of troopers who'd encountered the cultists. But most disturbing were the images, photographs of the monuments the cultists built, architectural diagrams that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, star charts showing constellations that shouldn't exist. "Where did you get this?" Vexenar whispered. "I'm Rebel intelligence," the figure admitted. "We've been monitoring Imperial activity in the Outer Rim. Something's happening that's bigger than the Empire versus Rebellion. We need people to know. Vexenar was about to negotiate a higher price when every light in the cantina flickered. The holographic displays showing gambling odds and entertainment feeds all went dark simultaneously. And then, they came back on, but they were showing the same image on every screen. A city. Towers of impossible geometry rising from an ocean of dark water. And at the center, something vast and patient, something that existed in too many dimensions for the displays to properly render. Every patron in the cantina stopped talking. Every being, regardless of species or background, stared at the screens with expressions of dawning horror and recognition. Because they had all seen this city before. In their dreams. Then the image vanished, replaced by static. The normal feeds resumed. But no one moved. No one spoke. They all knew, on some primal level, that something fundamental had changed. Vexenar looked at the hooded figure, who was trembling. What in the nine hells was that? That, the rebel agent said quietly, is what's coming. And the Empire can't stop it. Neither can we. Across the galaxy, on the forest moon of Endor, a tribe of Ewoks gathered around their shaman. The small beings normally lived simple lives, focused on hunting and avoiding the predators of their world. But their shaman had experienced a vision, a dream that all the tribe's Force-sensitive elders had shared. The shaman spoke in the musical language of his people, describing towers that shouldn't exist, water that moved wrong, and something vast approaching from beyond the stars. The Ewoks had no concept of space travel or galactic politics, but they understood predators. And their shaman's vision told them that the greatest predator in existence was awakening. They began preparing rituals of protection, weaving charms from sacred branches, and most significantly, they stopped venturing near the planet's oceans, which had begun to feel wrong to their Force-attuned senses. In the criminal underworld of the Hutt cartel, Jabba the Hutt received troubling reports from his network of spies and enforcers. Entire smuggling operations were being disrupted not by Imperial intervention, but by crew members simply abandoning their ships to join the growing cults. Valuable cargo sat unclaimed on landing pads because no one would approach the vessels after their crews vanished into the night, drawn by dreams of drowning cities. Jabba was not a being easily frightened, he'd built his empire through ruthless pragmatism and the willingness to eliminate any threat. But this was different. This couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or fed to his rancor. His own palace on Tatooine had developed areas where his servants refused to go, claiming they could hear whispers in languages that predated civilization. He sent his best hunters to investigate the nearest cult gathering, a group that had taken over an abandoned moisture farm in the Dune Sea. His hunters returned 3 days later, changed. They spoke in unison, their individual personalities erased. They spoke of the sleeper, of Leia, of the herald who would prepare the way. Jabba had them executed immediately, but the damage was done. Fear had entered his palace, and fear was contagious. On Bespin's Cloud City, Lando Calrissian stood in his private office, reviewing profit margins and trying to ignore the reports from his security chief. Workers in the lower levels had been forming gatherings, drawing symbols on the walls with substances that couldn't be identified. The symbols seemed to move when no one was looking directly at them, rearranging into configurations that hurt to perceive. Lando had always prided himself on his ability to read a situation, to find the angle that would turn danger into profit. But this? This defied every lesson he'd learned in a lifetime of gambling and deal-making. You couldn't bluff something that didn't care about winning or losing. You couldn't negotiate with something that didn't want anything you could provide. He'd heard whispers through his underworld connections, the rebels were investigating, the Empire was panicking, and neither side had any idea what they were facing. For the first time in his adult life, Lando Calrissian considered running. Not to another city or another planet, but out of the galaxy entirely, if such a thing were possible. In a forgotten temple on Lothal, former Governor Arinda Price knelt before a pool of water that had appeared overnight in the throne room. She had been demoted after failures involving Jedi insurgents, stripped of her authority and position. But now, she had found a new source of power. The water showed her visions, not of the future, but of a present that existed in dimensions adjacent to their own. She saw Leia in its full, impossible glory. She saw the sleeper, vast and patient, stirring in its sleep. And she understood that the Empire, the Rebellion, the Jedi, the Sith, all of it was meaningless compared to what was coming. She was not Force-sensitive, had never believed in such mystical nonsense. But the sleeper's power didn't require the Force. It was older, more fundamental. And it was offering her something the Empire never had, true transcendence, the dissolution of her limited consciousness into something vast and eternal. She began to speak, her voice joining the chorus of thousands across the galaxy. Phnglui mglw naf Cthulhu relio gunagolfdane. The water rippled. And in those ripples, Price saw her future, not as a governor or politician, but as a herald. She would prepare the way. She would gather the faithful. And when the stars aligned, when the dimensional barriers finally collapsed, she would be there to witness the awakening. On Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine reviewed the reports with growing frustration. He had spent decades consolidating his power, eliminating every threat to his rule. The Jedi were destroyed, the Senate was his puppet, and the military was an extension of his will. He had achieved what no Sith Lord before him had managed, absolute dominion over the galaxy. And now, something was threatening that dominion. Something he couldn't sense through the Force, couldn't manipulate through the dark side, couldn't eliminate through conventional means. For the first time since his transformation into Darth Sidious, Emperor Palpatine felt something he had not experienced in decades, genuine uncertainty about the future. The Executor hung in orbit above a nameless ocean world deep in the outer rim, its massive bulk casting shadows across the planet's turbulent surface. Vader stood on the observation deck, his breathing the only sound in the otherwise silent chamber. Below, the world was covered almost entirely in dark water, no continents, no islands, just endless waves that moved in patterns no natural ocean should follow. The Force told him nothing about this place. It was as if the planet existed in a void, a dead zone where that mystical energy simply ceased to function. He had encountered such anomalies before, ancient Sith temples, battlefields where so much death had occurred that the Force was scarred, but never anything on this scale. An entire world, invisible to Force perception. "My lord," Captain Piett said carefully from behind him. "The survey teams report something unusual. The water's composition is wrong. It contains elements that shouldn't exist in this galaxy. Molecular structures that violate known chemistry." "Show me," Vader commanded. Piett activated a holographic display. The molecular diagrams appeared, and even Vader's limited scientific knowledge was enough to recognize the impossibility. The compounds contained atoms with electron configurations that defied quantum mechanics, bonds that shouldn't be stable, yet somehow were. "Our scientists believe this world isn't entirely native to our dimension," Piett continued, his voice uncertain. "As if it's phasing between our reality and something else. The cultists we've interrogated keep referring to it by the same name, Leia." Vader turned from the viewport, his cape sweeping behind him. "Deploy atmospheric scanners. I want to know what's beneath that ocean." "We've tried, my lord. The water seems to absorb our scanning beams." "It's as if," Piett hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "As if the water itself is sentient and doesn't want to be examined." Vader's hands clenched into fists. "Prepare my shuttle. I will investigate personally." "My lord," the Emperor specifically ordered. "The Emperor is not here." Vader's voice carried an edge that made Piett step back. "I am. And I will not be intimidated by water, regardless of how unusual its composition." 20 minutes later, Vader's Lambda-class shuttle descended through the planet's atmosphere, accompanied by 2 squads of his best stormtroopers and 3 scientists. The 7th sister had requested to join him, but he'd refused. She was still recovering from the Geonosis encounter, experiencing hallucinations and Force disconnection episodes that even the Empire's best medical droids couldn't explain. The shuttle skimmed across the ocean surface, and immediately, everything felt wrong. The water didn't reflect light properly. It absorbed it, drank it in, creating patches of darkness that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. And the movement, waves rose and fell in rhythms that felt deliberate, purposeful, as though the ocean itself was breathing. There, Vader said, pointing toward the horizon. Those structures. Rising from the water were towers, massive, geometric constructions that hurt to look at directly. They were built from some kind of stone that shifted between colors the human eye couldn't properly process. The angles were wrong, creating spaces that appeared larger on the inside than the outside, surfaces that seemed to curve in 4 or 5 dimensions simultaneously. This was Leia. Not the true city, that still slumbered in deeper dimensions, but a reflection of it, bleeding through into their reality as the barriers thinned. The shuttle landed on what appeared to be a plaza constructed from that impossible stone. As the ramp descended, Vader felt it, or rather, he felt nothing. The Force, his constant companion since Mustafar, his source of power and pain, was simply gone. Not suppressed or blocked, but absent, as if it had never existed. He had felt this before, briefly, on Geonosis. But there, it had been like standing at the edge of a dead zone. Here, he was fully immersed in it. For the first time since his transformation, Darth Vader was completely, utterly mortal. His breathing apparatus struggled, compensating for the sudden absence of Force-assisted healing that had been maintaining his damaged lungs. Pain flooded through his cybernetic limbs as systems designed to work in tandem with Force enhancement failed to adapt. He staggered, catching himself against the shuttle's hull. Lord Vader, one of the stormtroopers, moved to assist him. "Stay back," Vader commanded, his voice strained. He forced himself upright through sheer willpower, through the discipline that had sustained him even before he'd fallen to the dark side. The Force was gone, but he was still Anakin Skywalker beneath the mask, still the man who had been the chosen one, still the warrior who had survived the lava of Mustafar. He could survive this. They moved deeper into the alien city, weapons ready but useless against what they might encounter. The architecture defied comprehension, doorways that led to spaces that shouldn't fit within the tower's dimensions, staircases that seemed to ascend and descend simultaneously, surfaces covered in glyphs that rearranged themselves when observed peripherally. One of the scientists, a human woman named Dr. Sarn, stopped before a wall covered in inscriptions. "My lord, these symbols, they're not language as we understand it. They're mathematical formulas describing geometries that can't exist in three-dimensional space. Whoever built this city was working with at least 5 or 6 dimensions. Or something built it that exists in those dimensions naturally," Vader said, his breathing labored. Every step was agony without the Force to dull the pain of his ruined body. But he would not turn back. He had faced armies, Jedi Masters, even death itself. He would not flee from stone and water. They found the first body in a plaza that seemed to shift between existing and not existing. A human male, dressed in the remains of a spacer's outfit, his body perfectly preserved despite obvious signs of having been dead for weeks. His eyes were open, staring upward at the alien sky, and his face bore an expression of transcendent ecstasy mixed with absolute terror. "Scan him," Vader ordered. Dr. Sarn ran her medical scanner, then looked up with confusion. "My lord, according to these readings, he's not dead. His brain is still active, but it's resonating at a frequency that shouldn't be possible. It's as if his consciousness has been separated from his body but remains connected somehow." Before Vader could respond, the corpse spoke. "The sleeper stirs in the abyss below. The stars align. The gateway opens. The herald prepares the way." The voice wasn't the dead man's, it was something speaking through him, using his vocal cords as an instrument. The same flat, emotionless tone they'd heard from the cultists on Geonosis. "Who are you?" Vader demanded, drawing his lightsaber. It ignited, the red blade casting crimson light across the impossible architecture, but he felt none of the familiar connection to the Kyber crystal, none of the Force resonance that made a lightsaber an extension of a Jedi's will. It was just a plasma blade now, no different from a common cutting tool. The corpse's head turned, fixing its dead gaze on Vader. We are the dreamers. We are those who have touched the truth beyond the Force. We are the heralds of Cthulhu, the sleeper in the abyss, the Lord of Leia. And you, Lord of the Sith, are but a shadow of a shadow compared to what awakens. I have destroyed the Jedi Order, Vader said, his voice carrying the full weight of his conviction. I have brought an entire galaxy under Imperial control. I will not be lectured by dead cultists. You destroyed nothing that mattered. The Jedi were insects. The Sith are insects. Your empire is an insect's nest. And when Cthulhu rises, even your memory will be erased from a reality that will no longer recognize the concepts you fight over. Vader raised his lightsaber to strike, but the corpse simply collapsed, truly dead now, whatever had animated it withdrawing. The other bodies in the plaza, and there were dozens of them, scattered across surfaces that seemed to exist at multiple heights simultaneously, all spoke in unison. The sleeper dreams, and we dream with it. Leia rises. The stars align. Then they too fell silent. Dr. Sarn's scanner was going haywire. My lord, I'm detecting massive electromagnetic anomalies beneath the ocean. Something is generating a field that's interfering with our instruments. Something or someone? Vader asked. I don't know how to answer that. The readings suggest intelligence, but on a scale I've never encountered. If this is a being, it's planet-sized, my lord. Vader looked toward the ocean, toward the dark water that moved with deliberate purpose. Somewhere beneath those waves, something vast and patient was awakening. He could not sense it through the Force, could not sense anything through the Force in this place, but he could feel it nonetheless, the way prey might feel the approach of a predator even in absolute darkness. He had come here to investigate, to understand, and to find a way to control or destroy this threat. But standing in this alien city, cut off from the Force that had been his identity for decades, Vader confronted a terrible truth. There were things in the universe that even the dark side could not touch. And this was one of them. Return to the shuttle, he commanded. We're leaving. As they retreated through the impossible city, Vader cast one final look at the towers of Leia. They stood eternal and patient, waiting for something that had been promised eons ago, when the galaxy was young and the Force was new. Behind those towers, beneath leagues of dark water, something stirred in its sleep. And when it fully awakened, Vader realized with cold certainty, the Emperor's carefully constructed empire would mean nothing at all. The Rebel Alliance had built its foundation on hope, the belief that tyranny could be overcome, that freedom was worth any sacrifice, that even the smallest spark could ignite a revolution. Mon Mothma had cultivated that hope carefully, nurturing it through every defeat, every loss, every moment when surrender seemed rational. But hope required a future to believe in. And the reports coming from rebel intelligence cells across the Outer Rim suggested that the future itself was becoming uncertain. Mon Mothma stood in the command center of the hidden rebel base on Yavin 4, surrounded by holographic displays showing star maps with disturbing patterns. Red markers indicated cult activity, 57 confirmed locations in the past 3 weeks alone. Blue markers showed Imperial forces responding. And the green markers, the ones that made her blood run cold, showed dead zones, regions where communication had ceased entirely, where rebel cells had gone silent, where reality itself seemed to have broken down. Tell me this is a new Imperial weapon, she said to General Davitz Draven, her chief intelligence officer. Draven was a pragmatist, a man who dealt in facts and strategic assessments. His expression now was something Mon Mothma had never seen before, genuine fear. If it were Imperial, they'd be using it against us. Instead, they're pulling forces from the core worlds, redeploying to the Outer Rim. They're scared, Mon Mothma. The Empire is terrified. And what terrifies the Empire should terrify us, Admiral Raddus added, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of decades of military experience. I've reviewed the intelligence from our agents embedded in Imperial facilities. They're encountering something they can't fight with Star Destroyers or Stormtroopers. Something that makes their force-wielding Inquisitors collapse. Mon Mothma pulled up one of the intelligence reports, footage taken by a rebel spy droid on Ryloth. It showed an Imperial garrison, 200 stormtroopers and officers, standing in perfect formation in the desert. They weren't moving. Weren't responding to communications. The spy droid had circled the formation for 20 minutes, and not a single trooper had reacted. Then, as one, they had all spoken. The sleeper stirs. Leia rises. The stars align. The troopers had then removed their helmets and walked into the desert, abandoning weapons, armor, and duty. Imperial search parties found them days later, gathered around a non-existent oasis, drawing symbols in the sand with their bare hands, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift even in recorded footage. "We need to understand what's happening," Mon Mothma said, her voice carrying the authority that held the Alliance together. "Send a team. Our best operatives, people who can investigate without drawing Imperial attention." "I volunteer," a voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Leia Organa entering the command center, her expression determined. The young senator had proven herself countless times, but this was different. This wasn't sneaking plans past Imperial blockades or inspiring systems to join the rebellion. This was confronting something that defied understanding. "Princess," Mon Mothma said carefully, "this isn't a diplomatic mission." "I'm aware." Leia approached the holographic display, studying the pattern of cult activity. "But it's spreading toward the core worlds. Alderaan is only 6 sectors away from the nearest reported incident. If this reaches my homeworld, I want to know what we're facing." Draven nodded slowly. "She has a point. We need someone who can think strategically, who won't panic when confronted with the impossible. And frankly, most of our field operatives are reporting psychological stress just from reading these reports." "I'll take a small team," Leia continued. "Han Solo and Chewbacca owe me a favor. And Luke Skywalker, the Force-sensitive boy from Tatooine. If this involves Force phenomena, we need someone who can sense what's happening." Mon Mothma wanted to refuse, to protect one of the Alliance's most valuable assets. But Leia was right, they needed to understand this threat before it consumed the galaxy. "Very well. But you take Captain Cassian Andor as well. His experience with deep cover operations may prove valuable." "When do we leave?" Leia asked. "Immediately. Your target is Rugosa, a mining colony in the Outer Rim that went silent 6 days ago. Small enough that the Empire hasn't prioritized it, but our last communication suggests something there is worth investigating." As Leia left to prepare, Draven moved closer to Mon Mothma, lowering his voice. "Are we sure we want to investigate this? The Empire has resources we don't. If they can't handle it, what chance do we have?" "That's precisely why we must investigate," Mon Mothma replied. "If this is something beyond the Empire's control, then perhaps it's something that doesn't distinguish between Imperial and Rebel. And if that's true, we may need to consider options we've never contemplated before." "Such as?" Mon Mothma didn't answer immediately. She was thinking of something she'd read in classified Jedi texts that Senator Bail Organa had recovered before the Purge. The text spoke of ancient threats, of beings that existed before the Republic, before even the earliest Force users. The Jedi had encountered them and chosen to seal away the knowledge rather than risk confronting them. "Such as accepting that some battles cannot be won," she finally said. "Only survived." On Tatooine, in a modest dwelling hidden among the sand dunes, Obi-Wan Kenobi sat in meditation, trying to quiet his mind. For weeks now, his connection to the Force had been unstable, flickering like a candle in a storm. He'd felt disturbances before. Order 66 had nearly shattered him with its psychic weight, but this was different. This wasn't violence or death. This was absence. As if something was systematically erasing the Force from sections of the galaxy, creating voids where that mystical energy simply ceased to exist. He'd tried to reach out to Yoda through their tenuous Force connection, but the ancient Jedi Master was silent. Either he was in deep meditation on Dagobah, or he too was struggling with this disturbance. Obi-Wan opened his eyes and looked at the small box in the corner of his dwelling, the box containing his lightsaber and the few Jedi artifacts he'd preserved. He'd sworn to remain hidden, to watch over Luke Skywalker until the boy was ready. But if the Force itself was under threat, what good would training a new Jedi do? He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the twin suns of Tatooine. And for just a moment, he could have sworn the space between the suns darkened, as if something vast had passed in front of them. But when he blinked, the sky was normal again. His hand moved to his chest, where his heart was racing. He'd felt something just then, not through the Force, but through pure instinct. The sensation of being observed by something so vast that his entire existence was less than a grain of sand on Tatooine's endless deserts. "Master Kagan," he whispered to the air, hoping his former master's Force ghost might answer. "If you can hear me, I need guidance. Something is coming that I don't understand. Something the Force itself seems to fear." There was no response. The Force ghosts had been silent for weeks, as if even the dead were hiding from what approached. Obi-Wan made a decision. He would break his exile, just once, to consult the ancient Jedi texts hidden beneath the Lars homestead, texts that Kagan had entrusted to him years ago, texts that predated the Republic itself. If answers existed, they would be there. Aboard the Millennium Falcon, Han Solo was having regrets. He'd agreed to help the princess with this job because she'd paid him well for the last one, and because, though he'd never admit it, he found her fascinating. But this? Flying to a dead mining colony to investigate reports of mass insanity? This wasn't what he'd signed up for. "I've got a bad feeling about this," he muttered, checking the Falcon's navigation computer. Chewbacca growled his agreement from the co-pilot's seat, his massive paws manipulating the controls with surprising delicacy. "Yeah, I know we need the credits," Han replied to his co-pilot's comment. "But there's profitable dangerous, and then there's stupid dangerous. This is starting to feel like the second kind." In the passenger hold, Leia was reviewing intelligence reports with Cassian Andor, a rebel intelligence officer who looked like he'd seen too much and slept too little. The man had a reputation for doing whatever was necessary to advance the rebellion's cause, ethics be damned. Leia respected his effectiveness even if she didn't always approve of his methods. "The last transmission from Rugosa was garbled," Cassian said, playing the audio file. Static filled the cabin, punctuated by fragments of voices speaking in unison, the same phrases the cultists across the galaxy had been chanting. Luke Skywalker sat apart from the others, his young face troubled. The farm boy from Tatooine had shown surprising Force sensitivity, enough that Leia had insisted he join them despite his limited training. Now, Luke's hand kept drifting to the lightsaber at his belt, the weapon that had belonged to his father, though he didn't know the full truth of that yet. "Do you sense something?" Leia asked him. Luke nodded slowly. "I'm not sure what. It's like, you know how you can tell when someone's watching you, even if you can't see them? It feels like that, but bigger. Like the whole galaxy is being watched by something that doesn't care what it sees." "That's cheerful," Han called from the cockpit. "Maybe you should stick to sensing lottery numbers instead of cosmic horror, kid." But Han's sarcasm couldn't mask the tension in his voice. Even he, who claimed not to believe in the Force or anything beyond what he could shoot or steal, felt it, that creeping sensation that they were flying towards something that would change everything. The Falcon dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Rugosa system. The mining colony hung in orbit around a gas giant, a small station that should have been bustling with activity. Instead, it was dark, its running lights extinguished, no response to their hails. "Life signs?" Leia asked. Cassian checked his instruments. "Positive. Approximately 200 beings aboard. But they're all in the same location, the central habitation module. And they're not moving." "Cultists," Leia said quietly. "Same pattern as the other incidents." As the Falcon approached the station, Luke suddenly gasped, doubling over as if he'd been struck. Something's wrong. The Force, it's like it's being pushed away. I can't feel it near that station. Can you still fight without it? Cassian asked pragmatically. Luke straightened, his jaw set with determination that reminded Leia of someone, though she couldn't place who. I was shooting womp rats before I knew anything about the Force. I'll manage. They docked with the station, weapons ready. As the airlock cycled open, they were greeted by silence, the kind of absolute quiet that only comes when something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. And somewhere in that silence, something vast and patient continued its inexorable awakening, drawing the galaxy closer to a truth it was never meant to comprehend. The mining station's corridors were bathed in emergency lighting, casting everything in blood-red shadows. The environmental systems were still functional, air circulated, gravity held, but the station felt wrong, as if the very architecture had been corrupted by something that didn't belong. Leia led the team deeper into the facility, her blaster raised and ready. Behind her, Han and Cassian maintained a defensive formation while Chewbacca's bowcaster swept for threats. Luke brought up the rear, his lightsaber unignited but his hand resting on its hilt. Anyone else notice the walls? Han whispered. Leia had noticed. The station's interior was standard Imperial mining colony construction, prefabricated Dura-Steel panels, functional lighting, utilitarian design. But in the red emergency lighting, the panels seemed to shift, their edges not quite aligning properly, creating angles that made her eyes hurt when viewed directly. Don't stare at them, Luke said, his voice strained. There's something about the geometry. It's like they exist in more spaces than we can see. They found the first signs of habitation in the crew quarters, personal effects scattered across bunks, meals left half-eaten, datapads displaying the same symbol over and over, a star-like pattern with too many points, arranged in configurations that seemed to rotate when not directly observed. Cassian picked up one of the datapads, scanning its contents. Personal logs. The miners started experiencing shared dreams 3 weeks ago. Dreams of drowning, of cities beneath alien oceans. The station's medical officer attributed it to psychological stress from extended space habitation. He scrolled further. Then the dreams got worse. People started drawing symbols they'd seen in their sleep. Some claimed they could hear voices speaking in languages that predated galactic civilization. Where are they now? Leia asked. Central Habitation Module. According to the station manifest, every single person aboard should be there. They proceeded through eerily empty corridors until they reached the module's main entrance. The doors were sealed, but Chewbacca made quick work of the access panel, forcing them open manually. The sight that greeted them would haunt Leia for the rest of her life. 200 beings, humans, Rhodians, Duros, Twi'leks, sat in concentric circles around a pool of liquid that definitely hadn't been part of the station's original design. The liquid was dark, almost black, and moved with deliberate purpose, forming patterns that hurt to perceive. The colonists' eyes were open but unseeing, their expressions serene. And floating above the pool, constructed from mining equipment, personal belongings, and materials that Leia couldn't identify, was a monument. It depicted something that existed in too many dimensions, part cephalopod, part dragon, part humanoid, part nothing the human mind was designed to comprehend. Stars above, Han breathed. What is that thing? Luke staggered, his face pale. I can't feel the Force. It's like someone cut off a limb I didn't know I had. This whole room, the Force won't enter it. One of the colonists spoke without turning to face them, her voice flat and emotionless. The sleeper stirs in the abyss below. The stars align. The gateway opens. The herald prepares the way. Then another colonist spoke, in perfect synchronization. The sleeper stirs in the abyss below. The stars align. The gateway opens. The herald prepares the way. Within seconds, all 200 were speaking in unison, the same words, the same inflection, as though a single vast intelligence was using hundreds of mouths as instruments. We need to leave, Cassian said, his professional composure cracking. Right now. But Leia stepped forward, her diplomatic training overriding her fear. She'd negotiated with Hutts, faced down Imperial officers, and stared into the mechanical face of Darth Vader without flinching. She would not be intimidated by synchronized chanting. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What have you done to these people?" The cultists turned as one, 200 pairs of eyes focusing on her with disturbing precision. When they spoke, their voices overlapped, creating harmonics that shouldn't be possible with humanoid vocal cords. "We are those who have touched the truth beyond your force. We are those who dream with the sleeper. We are those who prepare the way for Cthulhu, the Lord of Leia, the great old one who waits in the abyss between dimensions. We are those who have touched the truth beyond your force. We are those who dream with the sleeper. We are those who prepare the way for Cthulhu, the Lord of Leia, the great old one who waits in the abyss between dimensions." Cthulhu, Leia repeated, the name feeling wrong in her mouth, as if her tongue was rejecting it. "What does this entity want?" The cultists' expressions didn't change, but something like amusement colored their synchronized response. Want implies desire. Desire implies limitation. The sleeper does not want. It simply is. And when it fully awakens, your concepts of want, need, fear, love, all the petty concerns of finite beings, will be erased from a reality that will no longer accommodate such weaknesses. "You're planning to destroy the galaxy," Cassian said, his blaster aimed at the nearest cultist. "Destroy." The word echoed from 200 throats. "No. Destruction implies violence, opposition, conflict. The sleeper does not destroy. It transforms. It brings truth. Your galaxy is built on the lie of the Force, a mystical energy that binds living things together, that suggests consciousness and life have meaning. But the sleeper exists beyond such illusions. It is entropy given form, the inevitable heat-death of meaning itself. And it is awakening." Luke's hand tightened on his lightsaber. "Ben Kenobi told me the Force surrounds us, penetrates us, binds the galaxy together. If what you're saying is true, then how can something exist beyond it?" The cultists tilted their heads in unison, the gesture disturbingly synchronized. "Your master understood only part of the truth. The Force is vast, yes. It connects all living things, yes. But the universe is older than life. Vaster than consciousness. And in the spaces between stars, in dimensions your physics cannot describe, things wait that predate the Force itself. The sleeper is one such being. And it is patient." Leia felt something then, not fear exactly, but a creeping realization that they were out of their depth. The rebellion fought against tyranny, against the Empire's oppression. Those were comprehensible threats, enemies that could be reasoned with or defeated. But this? "Why tell us this?" she asked. "Why explain your plans?" "Because explanation is irrelevant. You cannot stop what comes. The Empire cannot stop it. Your precious Jedi could not stop it, which is why they sealed away the knowledge of the great old ones rather than confronting them. The only choice is acceptance. Join us. Dream with the sleeper. Find peace in the dissolution of your limited self." "I'd rather die standing," Han said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Death is an illusion. A temporary separation of consciousness from form. The sleeper offers something far more profound, the complete dissolution of consciousness into the infinite. No more pain. No more fear. No more meaning. Just eternal, peaceful nothing." The liquid in the pool began to ripple more violently. The monument above it seemed to pulse with a light that came from no physical source. And in that moment, Leia felt it, the sensation Luke had described. Not through the Force, but through something more primal. The awareness of being observed by something so vast that her entire existence was less than a single neuron firing in its incomprehensible consciousness. "We're leaving," she said, grabbing Luke's arm. "Now. They backed toward the door, weapons raised, but the cultists didn't move. They simply sat, staring at the monument, speaking their synchronized phrases. As the team retreated through the corridors, Leia heard something that made her blood freeze. The station itself was speaking. The bulkheads groaned with sounds that approximated language. The ventilation systems whispered phrases in dead tongues. The very structure of the mining colony was being corrupted, transformed into something that could house the consciousness bleeding through from dimensions beyond. They ran for the Falcon, not caring about stealth or caution. Behind them, reality itself seemed to be breaking down. Corridors stretched longer than they should. Doors led to spaces that couldn't exist within the station's dimensions. And always, that sensation of being watched, of being less than insignificant to whatever was awakening. They burst through the airlock and sealed it behind them. Han was at the controls before anyone else could speak, firing the engines and pulling away from the station with desperate speed. "What in the nine hells was that?" he shouted as the Falcon jumped to hyperspace. No one answered immediately. They were all trying to process what they'd witnessed, trying to fit it into a worldview that suddenly felt painfully inadequate. Finally, Luke spoke, his voice quiet and shaken. "I need to find Ben Kenobi. If the Jedi knew about these things, if they sealed away the knowledge, then maybe he knows how to fight them. Can they be fought?" Cassian asked, his pragmatism reasserting itself despite the horror in his eyes. Leia thought about the cultists, about the monument, about the sensation of being observed by something that regarded the entire galaxy as less than bacteria. "I don't know. But we need to find out. Because if this sleeper fully awakens, then everything we're fighting for, the rebellion, freedom, justice, none of it will matter." She activated the communication system, opening a secure channel to Yavin 4. "Mon Mothma, this is Princess Leia. I'm sending you our full report on Rugosa. You need to see this. And then you need to make a decision that no rebel leader has ever had to make." "What decision?" Mon Mothma's voice came through, concerned. Leia took a deep breath. "Whether the rebellion can afford to keep fighting the Empire when something far worse is coming. We may need to consider the impossible, allying with our enemies to face a threat that will destroy us all." The silence on the other end of the communication stretched for several seconds. Then Mon Mothma's voice returned, carrying a weight Leia had never heard before. "Prepare your report. I'll convene the Alliance leadership. May the Force be with us." As the Falcon raced through hyperspace toward Yavin 4, none of them noticed the shadows between the stars, the spaces where light didn't quite reach properly. None of them saw the way reality bent slightly in their wake, as if something vast was following them, patient and inevitable. In the unknown regions, beneath leagues of impossible water, Cthulhu stirred in its sleep. Not awakening, not yet. But dreaming. And its dreams were bleeding into reality, warping the galaxy one system at a time, preparing the way for its eventual return. Obi-Wan Kenobi's dwelling on Tatooine contained secrets even the Empire didn't suspect. Beneath the modest structure, accessible through a hidden panel disguised as part of the Sandstone Foundation, was a vault. Inside that vault were artifacts from the Jedi Order's most restricted archives, texts and holocrons that even most Jedi Masters had been forbidden to access. Qui-Gon Jinn had entrusted them to Obi-Wan years before his death, with a warning: some knowledge is dangerous not because it corrupts, but because it reveals truths the mind isn't meant to comprehend. Guard these well, and pray you never need to consult them. Now, kneeling before an ancient holocron that predated the Republic by millennia, Obi-Wan prayed his deceased master would forgive him. The holocron activated with a sound like breaking glass. Its gatekeeper appeared, not a Jedi, but something older. The holographic figure was humanoid, but its features were indistinct, as if the recording itself was trying to protect viewers from seeing too much detail. "You seek knowledge of the Abyssal Ones," the gatekeeper said in a language Obi-Wan shouldn't understand but did, as if the words bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his consciousness. "This knowledge comes at a price. To know of them is to be known by them. To speak their names is to invite their attention. Are you prepared for this burden? Obi-Wan's hand trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. I am. The galaxy faces a threat I don't understand. If the Jedi knew of these beings, I need that knowledge. The gatekeeper's form flickered. Long before the Force was understood, before the Jedi or Sith walked among stars, this galaxy belonged to others. We called them the Abyssal Ones, beings that exist in dimensions adjacent to our own, for whom time and space are mere suggestions rather than laws. They are not evil as you understand it. They are not good. They simply are, and their existence is antithetical to life as we know it. How did the ancient Jedi encounter them? They didn't. The Rakata did, the infinite empire that ruled through the Force when your republic was not even a dream. In their arrogance, the Rakata believed the Force made them invincible. They pushed into the unknown regions, seeking new worlds to conquer. They found worlds, yes. But those worlds belonged to the Abyssal Ones. The holocron displayed images, star maps showing regions of space that no longer existed on any modern chart. Entire sectors marked with symbols that hurt Obi-Wan's eyes. Entire Rakata fleets vanished. Worlds went silent. When survivors returned, they spoke of cities that violated geometry, of oceans that existed in wrong dimensions, of something vast and patient sleeping beneath reality itself. The Rakata called it Cthulhu, a name that is not truly a name, but an approximation of a concept mortal tongues cannot properly vocalize. How did they stop it? The gatekeeper's laugh was bitter. They didn't. They fled. They sealed off entire regions of space, forbidding travel there. They built warnings in languages meant to transcend time, here there be things that should not wake. Here the Force cannot protect you. Here madness dwells. The Rakata Empire fell to plague and civil war, but some scholars believe their collapse was accelerated by the psychic contamination from their encounter with Cthulhu. The madness spread even across light years. Obi-Wan leaned forward, his Jedi composure barely maintained. And the Jedi? We knew of this. The first Jedi discovered these warnings when they began exploring the galaxy. A council convened, the earliest masters, those who had only just codified the principles of the light and dark. They debated, should this knowledge be preserved or destroyed? Should the galaxy be warned of what slumbered in the abyss? What did they decide? They chose to bury it. To seal the knowledge in holocrons like this one, accessible only in the most desperate circumstances. Their reasoning was pragmatic, knowing of the Abyssal Ones would not help anyone fight them. The Force itself withdraws from their presence. A Jedi without the Force is just a mortal with a laser sword. Better, they thought, to let the galaxy live in ignorant peace than in terror of something they cannot defeat. But now it's awakening, Obi-Wan said. I can feel it, the Force recoiling, creating dead zones across the galaxy. If the Jedi couldn't fight it, what can we do? The gatekeeper was silent for a long moment. There is one possibility, recorded in the deepest archives. The Rakata discovered that the Abyssal Ones are bound by rules, cosmic laws that even they cannot violate. They sleep in dimensions adjacent to ours, able to influence through dreams and psychic pressure, but unable to fully manifest. Not unless conditions align. What conditions? Spatial geometry. Temporal synchronization. The stars must be in specific positions, dimensional barriers must thin, and most importantly, there must be heralds, beings in our dimension who prepare the way through worship and sacrifice. The Abyssal Ones cannot force their way through. They must be invited. Understanding dawned on Obi-Wan like a cold sunrise. The cults. They're not victims, they're facilitators. Precisely. Every cultist, every being that surrenders their consciousness to the sleeper's dream, weakens the barrier between dimensions. They become anchors, points where Cthulhu's consciousness can touch our reality. Enough anchors, in the right positions across the galaxy, and the barrier will collapse entirely. Then we stop the cults, Obi-Wan said. We sever the anchors. Easier said than done. Those who have touched the sleeper's consciousness are no longer fully individuals. Killing their bodies does nothing, their minds have already merged with something vast and eternal. You would need to eliminate every single one simultaneously, across the entire galaxy. Miss even one, and they can spread the contamination again. Obi-Wan stood, his mind racing through possibilities. Is there another way? Can the barrier be strengthened? Only one being in recorded history successfully reinforced the dimensional barriers, the gatekeeper said. A force user of unprecedented power, one who could sense the connection between living things across entire star systems. The Jedi called this being the Chosen One, one who could bring balance to the Force. The words hit Obi-Wan like a physical blow. The Chosen One. Anakin Skywalker. His former apprentice, his brother, the man who had become Darth Vader. But the Chosen One fell to the dark side, Obi-Wan said, his voice hollow. Light and dark are irrelevant to this task. The abyssal ones exist beyond such distinctions. What matters is power, the raw ability to touch the Force on a galactic scale, to strengthen the barriers that keep dimensions separate. If such a being still lives, they are your only hope. The holocron began to flicker, its power fading. One final warning, Jedi. In learning this, you have caught the sleeper's attention. It will know you seek to oppose its awakening. It will send its heralds. Trust not dreams. Trust not visions. And trust not the silence between heartbeats, for that is where it whispers loudest. The holocron deactivated, leaving Obi-Wan alone in the dark vault beneath his dwelling. He sat in silence, processing what he'd learned. The galaxy faced a threat that made the Empire seem trivial by comparison. The Jedi Order's most fundamental beliefs, that the Force was the ultimate power in the universe, that light would always triumph over dark, were revealed as comforting lies told to beings too small to comprehend the true scope of existence. And the only hope was Anakin. Vader. The man Obi-Wan had left to burn on Mustafar, the apprentice he'd failed so catastrophically. Master Kagan, Obi-Wan whispered to the darkness, if you can hear me, I need guidance. How do I convince the galaxy's greatest monster to save it from something even worse? There was no answer. The Force ghosts remained silent, perhaps hiding from the sleeper's attention. Obi-Wan was alone with impossible knowledge and an even more impossible task. He climbed back to the surface, emerging into Tatooine's night. The stars blazed overhead, distant and cold and indifferent. And somewhere among those stars, something vast and patient continued its inexorable awakening. Obi-Wan made his decision. He would leave Tatooine. He would seek out Vader, despite the danger, despite the certainty that confronting his fallen apprentice would likely mean his death. Because if the alternative was the entire galaxy being consumed by something that existed beyond good and evil, beyond light and dark, then his life was a small price to pay. He returned to his dwelling and began preparing. Equipment. Supplies. His lightsaber, inactive for years. And most importantly, a message, a recording to be delivered to Luke Skywalker if Obi-Wan didn't return. Luke, he said into the holographic recorder, his voice heavy with regret and determination, if you're watching this, it means I've failed. It means the sleeper has awakened, or I've fallen to Vader, or both. I cannot explain everything in this message, some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve in recordings. But know this, you are the son of Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One. His power flows through you. And if the worst comes to pass, you may be the only one who can finish what I could not. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Trust in the Force, but know that the Force is not absolute. There are things in this universe it cannot touch, cannot comprehend. If you face such things, do not rely on your lightsaber or your training. Rely on something deeper, the human spirit, the will to protect those you love, the refusal to surrender even when hope seems lost. These qualities exist beyond the Force, and they may be our only true defense against the darkness between stars. Obi-Wan deactivated the recorder and sealed the message, entrusting it to a protocol droid program to deliver it to Luke if Obi-Wan didn't return within 30 days. Then he walked out into the desert night, toward his hidden starship, toward a confrontation with his greatest failure, carrying knowledge that might save the galaxy or damn it beyond redemption. Above him, the stars maintained their ancient patterns. But if one looked carefully, if one knew what to seek, they might notice certain stars dimming, their light absorbed by something vast moving through the void between galaxies. The sleeper's influence was spreading. The cults were multiplying. The anchors were being established. And across the galaxy, in throne rooms and command centers and hidden temples, beings of power were beginning to realize that their wars, their politics, their carefully laid plans meant nothing in the face of what was coming. The Executor hung in orbit above the ocean world of Leia, surrounded by a fleet that represented the Empire's most devastating military assets. 12 star destroyers, 3 interdictor cruisers, and countless support vessels formed a blockade around the planet. On the surface, thousands of stormtroopers had established fortified positions around the alien city, their weapons trained on structures that defied military tactical analysis. Emperor Palpatine had ordered the most comprehensive assault in Imperial history. Not to conquer, there was nothing to conquer. But to contain, to study, and if possible, to destroy what was emerging from the dimensional abyss. Darth Vader stood on the bridge of the Executor, watching the planet below through the viewport. He could still feel nothing through the Force here, that absence was like a constant wound, a reminder that his power had limits he'd never acknowledged. But he would not retreat. He had survived Mustafar, survived the transformation into this mechanical shell. He would survive this. My lord, Admiral Piatt approached cautiously. The ground forces report the city is expanding. New structures are appearing, not being built, but manifesting. As if reality is being rewritten to accommodate them. Accelerate the bombardment schedule, Vader commanded. My lord, we've been bombarding those structures for 6 hours. Turbolaser fire, proton torpedoes, even orbital strikes. The city absorbs everything. Our weapons might as well be water hitting stone. Vader's hands clenched. Then increase the intensity. I want continuous bombardment until those structures collapse. Yes, my lord. As Piatt issued orders, Vader sensed something, not through the Force, but through the ship's sensors and his own cybernetic enhancements. A presence approaching from hyperspace. Multiple presences. Incoming vessels, the sensor officer announced. Rebel transponders. Multiple craft. They're hailing us. On screen, Vader ordered. The main display flickered to life, showing the bridge of a familiar-looking Corellian freighter. Princess Leia Organa stood at the center of the screen, flanked by the smuggler Han Solo and several rebel officers Vader recognized from intelligence reports. Lord Vader, Leia said, her voice steady despite the fear he could sense even without the Force. We need to talk. Rebels entering Imperial-controlled space will be destroyed, Vader replied coldly. You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't order your immediate execution. Because we're facing something that makes our conflict irrelevant, Leia said. You've seen what's happening on that planet. You've encountered the cults. You know that conventional weapons don't work against this threat. We have information that might help. And we're willing to offer a temporary ceasefire to share it. Vader considered. Every instinct told him to destroy the rebels while he had the chance. But the Emperor had been unusually interested in any information about the sleeper, and if the rebels had discovered something useful. You have 5 minutes to reach my flagship, Vader said. Any hostile action will result in your obliteration. The transmission ended. Within minutes, the Millennium Falcon and 2 escort craft were docking with the Executor. Vader met them in a conference chamber, surrounded by stormtroopers and with his lightsaber ready. If this was a trap, he would end it swiftly. Leia entered first, followed by Han Solo, Chewbacca, a young man Vader didn't recognize but who carried himself like a Force-sensitive, and Cassian Andor. Behind them came someone Vader hadn't expected. Obi-Wan Kenobi stepped into the chamber, his Jedi robes unchanged from the day Vader had left him on Mustafar. The old man looked tired, aged beyond his years, but his eyes held the same infuriating calm they always had. "Hello, old friend," Obi-Wan said quietly. Vader's hand moved to his lightsaber. "You should have stayed hidden, old man." "I would have," Obi-Wan replied, "if the galaxy wasn't facing extinction. We can settle our personal vendetta after we deal with the sleeper. If there's an after." "Stand down, Lord Vader," came a voice that made everyone in the room freeze. A holographic projection appeared, Emperor Palpatine, his yellow eyes gleaming with barely contained fury and something else. Fear. Vader had never seen fear in his master's eyes before. "My master," Vader said, kneeling. "I have been monitoring this situation closely," Palpatine said. "The rebels possess information from ancient Jedi archives. Information that may be crucial to understanding what we face. You will hear them out. And if they prove useful, you will ensure they survive to assist in the coming battle." The hologram flickered out, leaving stunned silence. The Emperor of the Galactic Empire had just ordered cooperation with the rebellion. The implications were staggering. "Everyone sit," Vader commanded, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled rage at being forced into this position. They gathered around the conference table, Imperials on one side, rebels on the other, with Obi-Wan standing apart as if representing neither faction. It was the most surreal gathering in galactic history, mortal enemies united by fear of something worse. Obi-Wan activated a holographic display from the ancient Jedi holocron. The images appeared, star charts, ancient warnings, the history of the Rakata's encounter with the Abyssal Ones. "The being you call the Sleeper is named Cthulhu," Obi-Wan explained. "It exists in dimensions adjacent to our own. It cannot fully enter our reality unless specific conditions are met, spatial alignment, temporal synchronization, and most importantly, conscious anchors, beings in our dimension who invite it through worship." "The cults," Vader said. "Precisely. Every cultist is an anchor point, a place where Cthulhu's consciousness can touch our reality. Eliminate the anchors, and we strengthen the dimensional barriers. Keep the barriers strong until the stellar alignment passes, and the sleeper returns to its dream." "We've tried eliminating cultists," Admiral Piatt interjected. "Killing their bodies does nothing. Their consciousness remains connected to this entity." "There may be another way," Obi-Wan said, his gaze fixed on Vader. "The ancient records speak of the Chosen One, a being of unprecedented force sensitivity who could sense and manipulate the connections between all living things across vast distances. Such a being could theoretically sever the cultists' connection to Cthulhu simultaneously, across the entire galaxy." Everyone in the room turned to look at Vader. "You're suggesting I save the galaxy," Vader said, his voice dripping with irony. "The same galaxy I've spent years subjugating." "I'm suggesting you have power that might make a difference," Obi-Wan replied. "Light side, dark side, those distinctions are irrelevant here. What matters is raw force potential. And you, Anakin, have more of that than anyone who has ever lived." The use of his true name made Vader's breathing hitch. "That man is dead." "Is he?" Obi-Wan stepped closer, his voice soft but penetrating. "Because the man I knew would never let the galaxy burn, regardless of his personal feelings. The man I knew believed in protecting the innocent, even at great cost to himself." "You don't know me anymore, old man," Vader said, standing abruptly. "That man died on Mustafar, burned away along with everything else." "Then prove it," Leia said suddenly, drawing everyone's attention. "Prove you're the monster you claim to be. Let this entity awaken. Let it consume the galaxy. Watch as everything, the empire you've built, the order you've imposed, even your master's carefully constructed plans, becomes meaningless dust." Vader turned to her, his breathing harsh. "You dare." "I dare because I've seen what's coming," Leia interrupted, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "I've stood in rooms where reality breaks down, where the Force itself flees in terror. And I know that if this sleeper fully awakens, there will be no empire, no rebellion, no heroes or villains. Just nothing. Just the end of everything that gives existence meaning. Han shifted uncomfortably. She's right, Vader. I don't like you. I don't trust you. But right now, you're the only one who might be able to stop this thing. Vader stood silently, his masked gaze sweeping across the assembled group. His enemies, offering him a chance at redemption he'd never sought. His former master, believing in a man who no longer existed. His emperor's implicit permission to act. And beneath the planet's impossible ocean, something vast stirred closer to wakefulness, patient and inevitable. What would I need to do? Vader finally asked. Obi-Wan pulled up another holographic display. Reach out through the Force to every anchor point simultaneously, every cultist across the galaxy. Sever their connection to Cthulhu all at once. It will require more power than any Jedi or Sith has ever channeled. It will likely kill me, Vader finished. You're asking me to sacrifice myself. I'm asking you to be what you were meant to be, Obi-Wan said softly. The chosen one who brings balance. Not through domination or control, but through sacrifice. Luke, who had been silent until now, spoke up. There might be another way. If multiple Force users work together, pooled their strength. There aren't enough Force sensitives left in the galaxy, Obi-Wan said sadly. The Empire saw to that. It would take hundreds, perhaps thousands, to generate the power needed. We have, perhaps a dozen, counting those here. Vader walked to the viewport, staring down at the planet where Leia rose from impossible waters. He could see the city now with his cybernetic vision enhancement, towers that existed in too many dimensions, structures that violated every law of physics, monuments to something that should never have been discovered. How long until the alignment, he asked. 48 hours, Obi-Wan replied. After that, the dimensional barriers will be at their weakest. If Cthulhu manifests fully, nothing we do will matter. Vader considered his options. He could refuse, let the sleeper awaken, and face oblivion with the rest of the galaxy. He could attempt the ritual and die in the process. Or he could find a third option, the kind of solution Anakin Skywalker had been famous for, the unexpected approach that changed everything. I will do it, Vader said finally. But not alone. And not the way you're suggesting. He turned back to the group. The cultists are anchors because they willingly surrendered their consciousness. What if we created our own anchors? Force users who remain conscious, who use their connection to the Force to strengthen the barriers rather than weaken them? That's, theoretically possible, Obi-Wan said slowly. But it would require perfect coordination across vast distances. One mistake, one person losing focus, and the entire network could collapse. Then we'll need to be perfect, Vader said. He activated the chamber's communication system. Admiral Piet, send a Priority 1 message to the Emperor. Tell him I require the immediate recall of all Inquisitors and any surviving Force sensitives in Imperial custody. And contact the rebel fleet. Tell them, he paused, the words physically painful to speak. Tell them we need their help. Leia stood, her expression unreadable. The rebellion will answer. But after this is over, Vader, we're still enemies. Agreed, Vader replied. But first, we save the galaxy we're fighting over. As the group dispersed to make preparations, Obi-Wan approached Vader one final time. Anakin. Don't, Vader cut him off. We are not friends. We are not master and apprentice. We are two beings forced to work together against a greater threat. Nothing more. Obi-Wan nodded sadly. As you wish. But know this, whatever you've become, whatever darkness you've embraced, you're still capable of this choice. That matters. Vader didn't respond. He simply walked away, his cape sweeping behind him, to prepare for a battle unlike any the galaxy had ever witnessed. Below, in the depths that should not exist, Cthulhu's dreams intensified. It sensed the resistance forming, the tiny sparks of consciousness attempting to defy its inevitable awakening. The sensation was amusing. Like bacteria attempting to resist an ocean. The sleeper would wait 48 more hours. Then it would dream itself into full existence, and the galaxy would learn what true insignificance meant. The assault on Leia began at dawn, though dawn meant nothing on a world where the sun's light bent wrong, creating shadows that moved independently of their sources. Across the galaxy, Force sensitives gathered at predetermined coordinates, forming a network that spanned hundreds of star systems. Inquisitors who had hunted Jedi now stood alongside their former prey. Rebel Force users meditated beside Imperial officers. Even the criminal underworld's scattered Force-sensitive outcasts had been recruited, promised amnesty in exchange for their participation. 47 beings, spread across the galaxy, linked through the Force in a network anchored by Darth Vader. On the surface of Leia, the final confrontation was taking place. The Empire had landed every available trooper, walker, and war machine. AT-ATs strode across alien stone, their massive legs struggling with geometry that didn't obey gravitational laws. TIE fighters screamed overhead, their weapons fire absorbed by towers that seemed to exist partially in other dimensions. The rebels had committed their forces as well. X-wings flew in formation with TIE fighters for the first time in history. Rebel troopers fought alongside stormtroopers, their old hatreds temporarily set aside. Han Solo found himself directing Imperial artillery, while Lando Calrissian, who had arrived with Cloud City's security force, coordinated air support with Imperial flight commanders. But none of their weapons mattered. Every shot, every explosive, every turbolaser blast was absorbed by the city as if the energy was being fed into something vast and hungry. Leia was growing, expanding, its impossible architecture spreading across the planet's surface like a cancer-consuming reality. Vader stood at the center of the Imperial landing zone, surrounded by a protective circle of the most elite stormtroopers. His breathing was steady, measured, despite the agony of maintaining Force connections across light years. Without the Force in this location, he had to reach outward, extending his consciousness to the edge of the dead zone and beyond, touching each of the 47 Force sensitives and linking them into a network. Obi-Wan knelt nearby, not fighting but meditating, adding his strength to the network. Luke Skywalker stood guard, his father's lightsaber ignited and ready, protecting both Vader and Kenobi from the cultists who were beginning to emerge from the city. Thousands of them. Maybe tens of thousands. Beings from every species and world, their eyes vacant, their movements synchronized. They walked toward the Imperial and Rebel forces without weapons, without armor, simply advancing with the inevitability of a tide. Hold fire unless they attack, Leia commanded through the comm system. They're victims, not enemies. But as the cultists drew closer, that distinction became meaningless. They walked into turbolaser fire without flinching, their bodies absorbing energy that should have vaporized them. When stormtroopers tried to physically restrain them, the cultists' touch caused hallucinations, madness, instant conversion to their cause. Fall back. Admiral Piet ordered. Establish a perimeter around Lord Vader. Nothing gets through. The battle became a desperate holding action. Walkers formed walls of metal. Starfighters strafed cultist formations. Rebel and Imperial forces fought side by side, not to kill, but to delay, to buy time for Vader to complete his task. In orbit, the Executor and the Rebel flagship Home One maintained position together, their weapons trained on the planet's surface. If Vader failed, both ships had orders to initiate Base Delta Zero, total planetary bombardment until nothing remained. It wouldn't stop Cthulhu, but it might delay its manifestation. Vader felt the network solidifying. Across the galaxy, Force sensitives were channeling their power through him, creating a web of consciousness that touched every cultist simultaneously. He could sense them all, millions of minds submerged in the sleeper's dream, their individual identities dissolved into something vast and cold. And beneath them, he felt it. Cthulhu. Not conscious in any way mortal beings understood consciousness. More like a vast, patient force of nature, an entropy given form and purpose. It didn't hate the galaxy or love it. It simply was, and its existence threatened to unwrite the fundamental laws that allowed life to exist. Now, Obi-Wan whispered beside him. The alignment is at its peak. If you're going to act, it must be now. Vader reached deeper into the Force than he ever had before. The dark side had always been his tool, anger, pain, hatred channeled into devastating power. But now he needed something else. He needed the strength Anakin Skywalker had possessed before his fall, the connection to all living things that the light side represented. For the first time since Mustafar, Darth Vader touched the light. It burned. Not with pain, but with truth. Every life he'd taken, every cruelty he'd committed, every moment of suffering he'd caused, all of it flooded through his consciousness. But beneath that, deeper than the guilt and shame, he felt something else, the connections. Every being in the galaxy, tied together through the Force, forming a web of life that was beautiful and fragile and worth protecting. The network of Force sensitives flared with power. Through them, through him, the Force reached out to every cultist across the galaxy. Vader could sense their minds, see the tendrils of Cthulhu's consciousness wrapped around their psyches like parasitic roots. Sever the connections, Obi-Wan urged. Cut them free. Vader gathered the full might of the network and struck. The Force became a blade, cutting through the dimensional barriers that allowed Cthulhu to influence mortal minds. One by one, then hundreds, then thousands, the cultists' connections were severed. Their vacant expressions flickered, consciousness returning as they were freed from the sleeper's dream. But for every connection severed, Vader felt himself diminishing. The power required was too much for even his enhanced body to sustain. His cybernetic systems began failing, overwhelmed by the Force energy channeling through them. Warning indicators flashed across his helmet's display. His respiratory system was compromised. His cardiac regulators were failing. He was dying. And he knew it. Anakin, stop. Obi-Wan's voice cut through the Force trance. You've severed enough connections. The barriers are strengthening. You'll kill yourself if you continue. Not enough, Vader gasped, his breathing harsh and irregular. Still, millions, connected. On the planet's surface, the cultists who had been freed collapsed, weeping, screaming, their minds shattered by their brief merger with something inhuman. But in the city of Leia, at the center of the impossible architecture, the monument pulsed with increasing intensity. Cthulhu was manifesting. The ocean around the planet began to rise, not with waves, but as if reality itself was being pulled upward. Water that wasn't water climbed into the sky, forming columns that reached toward the stars. And in those columns, shapes began to appear. Tentacles. Wings. Forms that existed in too many dimensions for human perception to properly process. It's too late, Cassian Andor said, his voice hollow with despair. The sleeper is awakening. Luke Skywalker stepped forward, his young face set with determination. Then we fight it. With what? Han demanded. We can't even look at that thing without going mad. With hope, Leia said, her voice carrying across the comm system to every rebel and Imperial soldier on the planet. With the refusal to surrender. With everything that makes us alive and conscious and defiant in the face of the void. Her words shouldn't have mattered. They shouldn't have changed anything. But somehow, they did. Soldiers who had been on the edge of panic steadied themselves. Pilots who were ready to flee held their positions. And throughout the galaxy, beings who had no idea what was happening felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to hope. The Force responded to that hope. Not just from the network of trained Force sensitives, but from every living being who refused to accept oblivion. The web of life that bound the galaxy together flared with power, not the focused, controlled power of the Jedi or Sith, but something rawer, more fundamental. The will to exist. Vader felt it flowing through him, millions upon millions of tiny sparks of consciousness all pushing back against the void. He channeled that power, using himself as a conduit, and struck at the heart of Cthulhu's manifestation. The dimensional barriers, weakened by eons of erosion and the cultist's influence, suddenly strengthened. Not because of any individual's power, but because the collective consciousness of a galaxy had decided, on a level deeper than thought, that reality was worth preserving. Cthulhu's manifestation faltered. The tentacles in the water columns dissolved. The wings that had been forming in the sky evaporated. The monument in the city cracked, and for the first time since its construction, it made a sound, a shriek that existed across multiple dimensions, expressing something that might have been rage or might have been amusement at the futility of mortal resistance. Then, like a dream fading upon waking, Leia began to recede. The towers sank back into the ocean. The impossible geometry simplified. The dimensional rift sealed, and with it, Cthulhu's connection to this reality was severed. Not destroyed. Not killed, it couldn't be killed, any more than entropy or time could be killed. But forced back into its dimensional prison, back into its eternal dream, to wait for another opportunity that might not come for millions of years. The silence that followed was deafening. Across the galaxy, freed cultists woke from their nightmares, their minds scarred but intact. The dead zones where the Force had withdrawn suddenly came alive again with mystical energy. And on the planet that had briefly been Leia, reality reasserted itself, the water returned to normal physics, the stone became simple stone, and the alien presence that had saturated everything withdrew like a receding tide. Vader collapsed. His respiratory system had failed completely. His cybernetic heart had stopped. Without the Force sustaining him, his ruined body finally succumbed to injuries that should have killed him decades ago on Mustafar. Luke rushed to his side, followed by Obi-Wan. They lifted Vader's helmeted head, and Luke reached for the mask's release mechanisms. "Don't," Vader whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let me die, as I am." "No," Luke said, surprising everyone. "You're not dying as Vader. You're dying as the man who saved the galaxy." He released the helmet seals and lifted it away. Beneath was a face, scarred, pale, but recognizable. Anakin Skywalker's face, aged and damaged but still human. Obi-Wan knelt beside his former apprentice, tears streaming down his face. "Anakin." "I'm sorry," Anakin whispered, his unsealed voice weak and ragged. "For everything. For failing you. For failing everyone." "You didn't fail," Obi-Wan said, gripping his hand. "You were the chosen one. You brought balance. Not the way the Jedi expected, but you did it." Anakin's gaze shifted to Luke. "My son." Luke nodded, unable to speak. "Then, there's still hope," Anakin said, managing a weak smile. "For the galaxy. For redemption." His eyes closed. His breathing ceased. And Darth Vader, the Emperor's enforcer, the scourge of the Jedi, died as Anakin Skywalker, the man who had defied cosmic horror itself to save a galaxy that had given him nothing but pain. The Force rippled with his passing. Every Force sensitive across the galaxy felt it, a presence that had been a constant dark pressure suddenly lifting, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like peace. Obi-Wan stood slowly, his face wet with tears. He's one with the Force now. All his pain, all his suffering, it's over. Leia approached, her expression complex. He killed billions. Destroyed worlds. Hunted my people to near extinction. Yes, Obi-Wan agreed. He did terrible things. But in the end, he chose to be something more than his worst actions. That doesn't erase what he did. But it matters. Around them, Imperial and Rebel forces were beginning to separate, old animosities reasserting themselves now that the greater threat had passed. But something had changed. Soldiers who had fought together couldn't simply return to seeing each other as faceless enemies. Officers who had coordinated strategies couldn't forget that their opponents were intelligent, capable beings rather than monsters. The seeds of something new had been planted, though it would take years for them to grow. Admiral Piett received a communication from Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine, his voice tight with barely controlled rage at Vader's death and the failure to control Cthulhu's power. All forces are to return to Imperial space immediately. The traitors who collaborated with rebels will be identified and dealt with accordingly. But Piett looked at the rebel ships in orbit, at the soldiers who had fought beside his troops, and made a decision that would change his life. Respectfully, Emperor, that will take time to coordinate. Perhaps, a few hours to allow the rebels to withdraw peacefully. The silence on the other end was dangerous. Then, you have 6 hours, Admiral. After that, any rebel vessel in range will be destroyed. It was enough. The rebels departed, carrying their wounded and their dead, carrying also the memory of what could be accomplished when enemies set aside their hatred for a greater cause. Luke Skywalker took his father's body, refusing to leave it for the Empire. Obi-Wan helped him carry Anakin to the Falcon, where they would give him a proper Jedi funeral. As they prepared to depart, Luke turned to Obi-Wan with a question that had been burning in his mind. What happened to it? To Cthulhu? Is it really gone? Obi-Wan looked up at the stars, his expression troubled. Gone. No. Contained, for now. Returned to its sleep in dimensions we cannot reach. But it still exists, Luke. And now that it has touched our galaxy once, it will remember us. Perhaps in 1,000,000 years, perhaps sooner, the stars will align again. The barriers will thin. And something will need to stand against it once more. Then we'll be ready, Luke said with the certainty of youth. Obi-Wan smiled sadly. Perhaps. Or perhaps we'll have forgotten, the way civilizations always forget. The Rakata forgot. The ancient Jedi sealed away the knowledge. We nearly lost everything because we chose ignorance over terrible truth. He placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. Don't let the galaxy forget, Luke. What we faced here, it's not the only horror waiting in the dark. The Force is vast and powerful, but it's not the only power in the universe. Remember that. The Falcon lifted off, carrying the body of Anakin Skywalker toward whatever lay beyond death. Behind them, the planet that had briefly been Leia returned to being just another ocean world, unremarkable and forgotten. But deep beneath its waves, in trenches that reached toward the planet's core, something remained. Not Cthulhu, that entity had returned to its dimensional prison. But echoes. Fragments. Traces of something that had briefly existed in 2 realities simultaneously. And in those echoes, a whisper, Pie Chenglui Mglw Naf Cthulhu Relio Gonagolftain. The sleeper would wait. Time meant nothing to it. And when the stars aligned again, when the barriers thinned, when mortal beings once more forgot the lessons written in the nightmares of their ancestors, it would return. For now, the galaxy had been saved. Not by the Empire's might or the rebellion's courage, but by the choice of one broken man to be something more than his worst self. And in the grand scope of a universe where cosmic horrors waited in the spaces between dimensions, that one choice had mattered more than all the star destroyers and Death Stars and galactic empires combined. The Force had been tested and found strong enough, barely, to hold back the void. But the victory was temporary, the peace fragile, and the future uncertain. As it always had been. As it always would be. The galaxy would never fully understand what had happened above the ocean world in the Outer Rim. Official Imperial records classified the incident as a contained dimensional anomaly requiring joint military response. Rebel historians documented it as the day enemies became allies against extinction. But most beings across the galaxy knew only that something terrible had been averted, something their leaders refused to discuss in detail. In the months that followed, the Empire and Rebellion returned to their war, but it was different now. Soldiers who had fought side by side couldn't quite summon the same absolute hatred. Commanders who had coordinated strategies remembered that their enemies were capable of honor. And in the darkest moments of the conflict, when annihilation seemed preferable to surrender, beings on both sides would remember, there were worse things than losing a war. The Force sensitives who had participated in the network were forever changed. They had touched something beyond light and dark, beyond the Force itself. Many left their factions entirely, seeking understanding in the galaxy's forgotten places. Others dedicated themselves to studying the ancient warnings, ensuring that future generations would know what slumbered between dimensions. Luke Skywalker cremated his father's body on Endor, watching the flames consume the armor of Darth Vader and the broken body of Anakin Skywalker. Obi-Wan stood beside him, and together they felt Anakin's presence in the Force, not tormented or dark, but at peace, finally free of the pain that had defined his life. He was more than his worst actions, Luke said, echoing Obi-Wan's earlier words. Yes, Obi-Wan agreed. But he was also responsible for them. Both truths exist simultaneously. That's what it means to be human, to contain multitudes, to be capable of both terrible cruelty and profound sacrifice. Emperor Palpatine raged at the loss of his most powerful enforcer, but even his fury was tempered by a new awareness. He had felt Cthulhu's presence at the edges of his consciousness, had sensed something that made his mastery of the dark side seem trivial. The Emperor would continue his conquest, would continue building weapons of ultimate destruction, but a seed of doubt had been planted. His empire, vast as it was insignificant compared to the true scope of the universe. Mon Mothma and the rebel leadership faced their own crisis of purpose. They had allied with their greatest enemy to survive. That pragmatism had saved the galaxy, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the absolute nature of their moral stance. Could evil ever truly be absolute if circumstances could demand cooperation with it? The debates would continue for years. On Tatooine, in a modest dwelling, a protocol droid deleted a recorded message that would never need to be delivered. Obi-Wan had returned, and the galaxy had survived. For now. The criminal underworld's Force sensitives who had participated returned to their lives, carrying secrets that made them simultaneously valuable and dangerous. Jabba the Hutt learned that some of his enforcers now refused certain jobs, claiming they had seen what true horror looked like and wouldn't add to it for mere credits. The cult survivors, those whose consciousness had touched Cthulhu and returned, were forever scarred. Most could never speak of what they'd experienced. Some took their own lives, unable to reconcile mortal existence with the memory of having been part of something vast and terrible. Others found purpose in warning systems, traveling the galaxy to share their nightmares as cautionary tales. And in the unknown regions, Imperial explorers marked certain coordinates with the highest level of prohibition. Here there be things that should not wake. The warning was recorded in every language, broadcast on every frequency, embedded in navigation computers across the galaxy. Future generations might ignore those warnings, might push into forbidden space driven by curiosity or greed. But the warnings would be there, a legacy of the day the galaxy nearly ended. Deep beneath nameless oceans on forgotten worlds, fragments of Leia's architecture remained. Stone that existed in too many dimensions, glyphs that rearranged themselves when unobserved, monuments to something that had briefly touched reality before being forced back into dimensional sleep. These fragments called to sensitive minds, whispering promises of transcendence, of escape from the limitations of mortal consciousness. Some would answer those whispers. New cults would form. The cycle would begin again, slowly, over centuries or millennia. But for now, the barriers held. The Force flowed unobstructed. And the galaxy lived in blessed ignorance of how close it had come to learning that consciousness itself was a temporary aberration in a universe that preferred the peace of eternal void. The war between empire and rebellion would continue. Heroes would rise and fall. Planets would be destroyed and others liberated. The great game of galactic politics would play out across generations. But those who had stood on the surface of Leia, who had felt the sleeper's attention, would carry a different perspective. Their wars, their conflicts, their grand ideologies, all of it was meaningful only because beings chose to give it meaning. And that choice, That defiant insistence that mortal concerns mattered despite cosmic indifference, was itself a kind of heroism. The Force would endure, binding the galaxy together. But now, some knew the truth. It was not the only power, not the ultimate reality, just one thread in a vast and terrifying tapestry that extended far beyond mortal comprehension. And in that knowledge lay both despair and hope. Despair at the insignificance of all mortal endeavor, hope in the fact that insignificant beings had nonetheless chosen to fight, to sacrifice, to matter in defiance of a universe that suggested they shouldn't. That was the true legacy of the day Cthulhu came to Star Wars. Not that cosmic horror could be defeated, but that it could be defied. Not that the darkness could be destroyed, but that even the smallest light refused to be extinguished. May the Force be with you. More stories await.